Welcome to the second Building Backyard Habitat. We're going to probably have some more people coming on here shortly, but thank you all for coming. I'm Morgan Sussman. I'm one of DNR's outreach specialists, and I'll be helping you guys with questions today. You guys are welcome throughout this presentation to drop questions into the chat box, which if you're on a computer, look up top. It's called Show Conversation. And then if you're on a mobile device, you can find it in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. With me here today virtually is Jessica Merkling, our North Region urban biologist, and she's our habitat expert. So Jessica, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and you're welcome to get started. You're muted, Jessica.
Is that better? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. Thank you for that introduction, Morgan. As Sherry mentioned, I can't see any of your questions while I'm giving the presentation, so if you need anything, contact her. So I guess with that, we'll get started. Welcome to the second Building Backyard Habitat Part 2, where we discuss installing your habitat and the first maintenance that you will do. And as the last presentation was, this is going to be heavily focused on urban areas because I am an urban biologist. But please note that this is pretty applicable across the board, at least in the basic concepts. And as Morgan already mentioned, I'm the North Urban Biologist, and at the end we'll have plenty of time for questions. So to recap, for those of you that may be curious what we covered at the last presentation, so the first thing that we covered the benefits of small-scale habitat, so we could really get a feel for why we're creating these habitats to begin with. We also talked about how we need to utilize urban areas for habitat to create room for all of Indiana's wildlife. As urban areas become larger and larger, we potentially have more human interactions with wildlife. So we have to start figuring out ways in which we can create space so all can safely coexist. There are over 897 species of wildlife in Indiana, so we really have to work hard to create space for all of them. There's also a lot of benefits for both human and wildlife health. We also talked about site selection, including things like ownership, what local ordinances may restrict what you may be doing, what the goals of your habitat would be. We talked about resources that you would have available to maintaining your habitat and what your site conditions should be. And then we also talked about site preparation, which boils down to good seed to soil contact. And then we also talked about using your site conditions not only to determine what site you're planting, but how to prep it, and it'll also go into your seed selection. And then we really just talked about not giving up and how creating habitat takes time and flexibility. So for this presentation, we're going to talk about selecting plants, how to install those plants in a couple of different ways, the maintenance that you will do mostly in the first year to 3 years, and then some other enhancements that you might incorporate to make your habitats even better. So with that, we'll get started on plant selection, and this is a little bit covering a lot of what we talked about the last time about there's benefits to humans and wildlife. And for the purposes of the Division of Fish and Wildlife, we're going to highly encourage people to use native plants because those are the ones that are more likely to benefit our native wildlife, and they can also benefit humans as well. One of the biggest things is the clean air, clean water, and healthy soil, and that's accomplished through filtration of water through the deep roots of some of our native plants. This picture, there's a lot of variances of it, but you can see our non-native plants only go about 3 to maybe 4 feet deep, and then some of our native plants, especially these three for sure in Indiana, go down to 16 feet, and there's other plants that go down to 20 feet. And those deeper root systems have more surface area to filter chemicals and other pollution that would eventually go to everybody's drinking water. A diverse habitat can be used for the natives. A diverse habitat creates space for diverse wildlife, creating more room for wildlife. The diverse habitat also can increase an aesthetic value of a planting. When you have large stands of all the same type of thing, like turf grass or large monocultures of field, there's not a lot of diversity or habitat for different wildlife. When you plant native plants, you're also helping to combat invasive species. And what we talked about last time is the top two reasons for loss of biodiversity in the world is one, loss of habitat, followed second by invasive species. As a nation, we already spend like $120 billion annually. Sorry, $120 billion annually to combat invasive species. So we might as well be proactive and prevent them from invading in the first place. They also provide the habitat for pollinators, which are pretty much the basics of everybody's food chain. A good example of this is birds. A lot of people in Indiana and all over the world love birds. But realistically, what we've been seeing is in the last 50 years, we've lost about 30% of our birds. And some of that is contributed by the loss of pollinators and their habitats. Most birds, up to 96%, actually use insect protein to develop and grow. A lot of people always put out seed, but realistically, baby birds need that insect protein as well. And then for humans, pollinators are actually directly or indirectly responsible for 1 in every 3 bites of food that you take. And that's a native pollinator, not necessarily your honeybees, which have their place. But if you think about honeybees, are also not native. So we have to also encourage our native pollinators as well. We also talked about how native plants can aid in wildlife conflict mitigation, specifically Canada geese. And then because native plants are evolved to our native conditions, there's overall a reduction in maintenance, including things like watering, mowing, fertilizing, which can save both time, money, effort in the long run. So when we talk about plant selection, if I can convince you to use natives, the first question a lot of people want to know, and a tough question, is often where you can buy native seeds. Our website does have a list of native seed suppliers. It's underneath our Habitat and Wildlife Landowner Assistance tab. In addition to being seed suppliers, a lot of people on that list are also local contractors. That list is by no means comprehensive, but it is a good start. There's a lot of other good native websites that have resources as well. One of them is Indiana Native Plant Society. They have a list where you can actually have growers that have both native and non-native options, but then you can even be more selective in using native only. Then there's a lot of also local native plant sales. Things like Indiana Wildlife Federation does them for growing fundraisers. I've seen them at county and state fairs. So those are all places to look. It can be a little bit challenging, and we're aware of that when we recommend planting native plantings, but a lot of the places on those seed suppliers do have sales every year. A lot of those places have contractors and other good sources as well. So when you're thinking about plant selection, before you get too much into, what you're picking out and all that stuff, you need to be really aware of what's in the mix, not just what the mix is called. So when you get your mix, you need to make sure you're looking at where your seed is coming from and how you're purchasing it and maybe what's actually in the mix. Recently, I had a landowner call me and they said that they ordered a native plant mix that was marketed for Indiana. And after 2 years, she said she didn't see anything. So I asked her if she could please send me the seed list to see if maybe we could see what was happening. And when I looked through there, I noticed there's things like Siberian wildflower, Shasta daisies, which are invasive, and California poppies. So none of those are really suited for Indiana, and some of them can actually be detrimental to Indiana's plants. So I dug even further, and the website even stated much of our wildflower seed comes from the fertile growing regions of Central California and Oregon, while other species are produced in Europe, Africa, and Asia. So that's really not conducive to the idea of native plants. You also want to be very wary of planting seeds that arrive in mail or are promotional seeds. I'm sure we all probably remember back this summer where people started receiving random seed packets that they did not order, and a lot of people started kind of throwing them out just to see what happens, and we really don't want to do that if we don't know what the source is, because it can lead to problems down the road. Another idea for a promotional example, back in 2017, there was a popular cereal that wanted to promote bee habitat. But when they packed seeds in the boxes for people to plant, they actually didn't make mixes that were good on a local level. And some of them even had invasive species. So we don't want to be doing that. Keep in mind that local seed especially if you're going native, is best adapted for the local conditions. That includes the water amount, sunlight amount, wildlife, whatever it may be. They're best suited to survive. Excuse me. And then you also want to the other things to keep about local seed, the last I had heard, and there's some variance on either side, but you really want seed recommended to be sourced within 200 miles. Obviously, you have to deal with what you have to work with, but that's something to keep in mind. And then you also should definitely keep your cost in mind. It not only drives what you can do down the road, long-term maintenance, or how you maybe prep your site, but you have to think about more showier and more rare seeds are probably going to cost more money, and planting plugs will cost more money than maybe planting seeds. So those are all things to think about. If it's not for wildflowers, even native trees and shrubs, the size that they might cost more if they're bigger, but there might be some added benefits, as in the reduced risk of losing them later down the line. So all those things have to be kept in mind. One way of selecting seeds is you could actually physically collect them yourself, but there's some things that you should keep in mind when you do that. One of the biggest things is you need to make sure you have permission to collect seed from an area. Many parks have a no collection policy, so it's really important that you reach out to those parks and look at the rules and regulations ahead of time. Also keep in mind that the window of collection is really variable among species. Some species are available only for a few days. Some are actually available for several weeks. And if you miss your opportunity or your window of opportunity in one part, you might just want to wait until your next season instead of trying to go back through and make it work. So that's something to keep in mind. You want to collect from at least 5 sites between a half a mile to a mile apart. That can give you a little bit of diversity and keep you from collecting everything in one area. And you also don't want to be collecting more than 10 to 20% of the seed available in an area. So you don't want to keep overly collecting if others have already done so in an area. You might also even have to do multiple seed collection methods, and you might have to go back multiple times to get the variable bloom periods and times to really diversify your mix. When you think of your collection methods, it might be helpful to look ahead of time on how you're going to collect that seed, especially if you know what plants you're collecting from. Some methods can be as easy as shaking a stem, clipping the stem. Some of them, though, are a little more involved, like if you cut off the whole fluorescence and wait for it to mature and then allow it to dry. So those are things to think about. Again, you really don't want to damage the existing vegetation and existing community. So making sure you're being aware of over trampling an area, stay on the pathways if they're given, those types of things as much as possible. A lot of people, if they find an endangered species, whether it be a plant or animal, have the desire to take it and preserve it. But the goal of an endangered plant species is to let it proliferate where it's already native and growing. So keep those things in mind when you're out there looking. And then the other thing is once you get your seed, you want to store it in a cool, dry place until you plant it. The general rule of thumb is that you don't want the total of your temperature and your relative humidity to be above 100. And once you collect it, seed is good for about 2 years. And this picture kind of just shows you different seed, but it's also going to come into play later, but you won't see this picture again, so I just want to point it out. A couple of slides ago, you saw an image with 5 different seed packets, and these are the seeds from that packet, and this just kind of shows you the high variability in different seed sizes. So that's why it's kind of important to think about seed collection methods and how much seed is in an amount, and that'll help you keep in mind making your mixes down the road. So when you're building a mix, you want to aim for about 18 different species. Again, this is heavily focusing on pollinator plantings, but this is recommended for grassland plantings and prairie plantings as well. Unfortunately, when we talk about grasslands and prairies, there are a lot of forbs in those mixes, but they don't get often highlighted. So just keep in mind that they are present there. Just sometimes we think so heavily on pollinator that we think it has to be all flowers, when realistically there's flowers and grasses in both types of mixes. When you have 18 different species, you want to make sure you're varying the height, the flower type, the flower color, and the bloom period. A good rule of thumb for pollinators specifically is that you want to plant 3 colors in each growing season. This helps give your planting year-round aesthetics, and it also provides a year-round food source for those pollinators and other animals that may use those flowers, seeds, what have you. Again, diversity helps combat invasions and from other non-native species. And if there's a disease or a pest or a blight, if you have more species, let's say maybe 2 different plants are affected by that, you still have 16 other species growing instead of just completely wiping out everything you planted. A good thing to do that I like to do, maybe not everyone's as detail-oriented as I may be, but you can create a spreadsheet, something like this, where you have your common name, and then I list out the months, and you can kind of see the different bloom periods. And that way you can look at the early season, how many colors you have, and you can see the variety, and it can maybe help you create more of a showier mix. When you do build mixes, one of the things that I want to highlight as a resource, although it's pretty complicated, is the NRCS seeding calculator. It's really helpful, and we'll get in a little more detail on that later. But when you're thinking about building your mixes, please note that it's important to include diverse grasses. It can be bunch grasses, sedges, what have you, but it's really good to have those in your mix. Native grasses help with your stand improvement. It helps reduce weed competition, and they're also good hosts for pollinators as well, and they do provide good nesting material for both pollinators and other wildlife. There's also a good thing to think about shrubs and trees as well. When we think of pollinator habitats, a lot of people only think of wildflowers, but shrubs and trees also bloom, so it's important to think about those as a resource as well. If you think about something like the spice bush swallowtail, you know, spice bush is part of its natural life cycle. So that may be something to incorporate into your planting. So I talked about the NRCS seeding calculator, and bear in mind that this is referring to seeds, but you can use something similar to this if you're thinking about building a mix from plugs as well. You obviously don't have to know the number of seeds in that mix, but it kind of helps you kind of think about what plants may be good for your site. So when you get the NRCS seeding calculator, there is an instructional page if you get online and download the Excel file. But what you can do on these things, you can enter your site conditions. I don't know if you can see it really well, and I put in the county, but you can't see it at that level yet. But you can type in your soil moisture, which is something we talked about at the last presentation, the amount of sunlight, if it's a floodplain, if there's a muck site, those types of things. Those can all be things that you can enter. Now, this may not be applicable to everyone because there's some other NRCS programs that you can put for your planting type and your species focus. But just keep in mind that's something that you can do. It is pretty complicated. Even if you don't use this type of calculator, it's something that you can look at and create spreadsheets to think about those things if you really want to try and make a really good mix. But either way, you want to try and aim for about 20 seeds per square foot. This can be a little complicated because historically we thought about just labeling the number of pounds per acre, which is a great way of doing it, but what was being noticed was that there wasn't that many seeds per square foot by the time you did that. And if you think about wind or rain or water or an animal carrying off a seed, then you have to think about what will actually be left over to germinate and grow. So that's why they came up with a minimum of 20 seeds per square foot. Most of the biologists in the division use this seeding calculator, and I think a lot of people probably stay in the 30 to maybe even 40 seeds per square foot. But that's also good to keep in mind because a lot of seed suppliers tend to market seeds up to 60 seeds per square foot in 1 acre, in a bag that's meant for 1 acre. There's nothing wrong with doing extra seeding, but it may be a tip for landowners to keep in mind if they're looking to spread their money a little bit further. So if a bag says it's 60 seeds per square foot and will only plant 1 acre, maybe you can get 2 and 3 acres out of it instead. Another good thing about this seeding calculator is it does calculate recommended grafts to Forbes ratio, and it even talks about your pollinator quality, and it does do a little bit of that blooming period and blooming color if you really want to look into it. It is a very scary, daunting calculator, and I'm pretty sure most biologists are always tinkering with it to build better mixes. But I think it's important for you guys to be aware that it is a resource available to anyone who wants to get online and work with it. Another thing to consider is cover crops. Things like Canada Wild Rye can be included in some of this or in your other mixtures. They're there temporarily just to provide cover so that your site stays ready and doesn't get invaded while your native seed is germinating. It can be a little bit scary because you're afraid, like, if all your rye comes up and none of your plants come up, but realistically those cover crops are designed to eventually go away as your seeds establish. So remember, once you have your plant selected, before you seed or plant or any of those things, keep in mind you still really want good seed to soil contact, and that is really, really important. It sounds so easy to just say, yeah, the soil's ready, but really make sure you have that good contact. And this picture was used in the last presentation, but I want to point out, this was initially just turf grass, this was a field, this was along a building, and this was eventually going to be turned into a rain garden. But all of them, you can see there's pretty much soil that is getting planted into. This one was planted in plugs, this one was plugs, and these were both seed. So just keep that in mind. So once you have your seed collected or your plants around, and then you have good seed site prep, you can start doing your installation. There's a couple of different methods we'll talk about. Again, I'm heavily relating this back to urban areas, but some of these general processes are applicable in other areas as well. So one of the ways to plant seed is using a no-till drill, and this is usually done in the fall when the temperature is below 55 degrees, or in the spring when the temperature is above 65 degrees. And the reason it's called a no-till drill is because ideally you're trying to disturb the seed bank as little as possible to help minimize weed competition. If you start stirring up that soil, you could potentially stir up the seed bank, which may have invasive or undesirable species. It can be a little bit tricky though for a drill because you do need to calibrate it. A lot of our native seed is really small, very light, and very fluffy. So it can be a little bit difficult to properly calibrate a drill for these. Fortunately, there's a lot of videos online. We don't have time to go over all of them today, but Purdue Extension, as well as a lot of other YouTube videos, have really great resources to show you how this can be done. Once you calibrate it, you do also need some filler to increase bulk. If not, it's just, like I said, it's super light and fluffy and it's hard to get in the ground. The filler can be things like kitty litter, vermiculite. Some people have used cracked corn. But remember, wherever you're planting, especially in an urban area, if geese are some of your problems, you may not want to use cracked corn as your filler. So keep those in mind. Usually there's a bunch of different ratios they can do. Usually it's 1-to-1, but you can adjust it for different rates. It can also be a little bit challenging to calibrate your drill because those are often calibrated by your ounces per acre or your pounds per acre, and we just talked about how we're thinking newly about seeds per square foot. Fortunately, if you use that calculator, it actually does have the option to enter as ounces or as number of seeds per square foot, so you should be able to get either or, and that can help you calibrate your drill. When you're calibrating it, you're calibrating it for the proper planting depth. You do not want to plant your seeds deeper than 1/4 inch, and I've recently learned some of that may even be too deep. The proper planting depth for any seed is twice the width of the seed. So if you think about those itty bitty tiny seeds in that slide I showed you, that can be really hard to make sure you're not planting too deeply. Additionally, drills can be hard to get your hands on if you don't already have one. There are some places like Pheasants Forever, Quails Forever that have equipment available for rent. There are some areas that the Division of Fish and Wildlife may be able to help, but those are very limited, so that can be a challenge. One of the benefits for no-till drilling is it's actually helpful for you to visualize your success down the road. Because you're seeding in rows, you can actually look down a road to see if it's establishing as you wanted. The other method for planting seed that is actually probably what I would recommend most often is to broadcast or frost seed. This can be used for almost any type of seed that you're doing, especially native seed, and it's a really good money-saving option, and it has really minimal effort. Again, you're still wanting to do the fall when it's less than 55 degrees or in the spring when it's greater than 55 degrees. But realistically, the goal is to make sure you're not planting any later than June 15th. That's not really a hard date, but it's a good rule of thumb to go by. And when you're doing the broadcasting or frost seeding, what you're doing is relying on the natural freeze and thaw cycles and the natural wet and dry cycles of Indiana for seeds to get in at the proper depth and for them to break their dormancy and start growing. If you're going to do broadcasting, you want to do a firm surface. Firm surface kind of prevents you from going too deep into the soil. And also make sure that you can even drive your equipment if you're choosing to use equipment. You don't necessarily need specialized equipment to do broadcast seeding. Some people can use just those normal handheld spreaders, but in this project, these are all actually third graders, and we essentially gave them a bucket of seed, like a sand bucket you would take to the beach, and they just took handfuls and scattered it into the dirt. And this is what it looks like a year later, and it's looking phenomenal. So that is something really easy to do. It's a good educational component as well. Again, you'll still need to make sure you need filler to increase bulk. There's a lot of different recommendations depending on what you're using as your filler. But if you're looking for a quick reference, a 40-pound bag of kitty litter mixed with the seed used for 1 acre should be plenty for you to get that 1 acre planted. Again, you don't want to make sure it's not planted too deeply, and it's actually okay if up to 30 to 60% of your seed is exposed on the surface. So there's no need to panic if it's not way down in there. The next type of installation is actually plugs, and a plug is just a plant that's already started to grow. You can kind of see that a little bit in the picture. They're just really young little plants that are starting to grow. These can be really helpful for areas where you may need faster establishment and show your areas, so that way it looks a little bit more neat and organized, especially in urban areas. They're really good for things like rain gardens and bioswales, which are going to get inundated with water and maybe not so good for seeds. Again, you can really visualize the final result. So this project, we actually sectioned it off so that you got one species in each area. The general rule of thumb, if you're going to use plugs, is 1 plug per square foot. Plugs also give you a little bit more flexibility in your time of planting. You still want to make sure, excuse me, you want to make sure you're avoiding really hot, dry days though, and in the middle of the afternoon where the sun may be brightest and hottest. But generally, you can still get them done. As you can see, this was planted in September 2018, which was usually a little bit later than what we would like, but as you can tell by this year, it's doing very well. It's still really important to properly plant them. So when you have the plug, it's important that you dig a hole deep enough for the whole soil mass to get in there, but not so deep that the stem starts getting buried as well. A really good trick that I was taught to plant a bunch of plugs quickly is get a drill bit with a 2-inch bit on it and just drill the holes that way. Trust me, it makes the project go a lot faster. You also, again, want to make sure you're not using fertilizer. Fertilizer can actually increase your competition of weeds in a native planting. For plugs, a lot of people kind of get really worried about watering plugs. Realistically, you only may need to water the first year when it's extremely dry. Otherwise, if you get the soil ready to go ahead of time, you shouldn't need to. Maybe just water them when you first get them planted, but otherwise, you can really reduce your watering costs. Mulch is a really good way to make a planting look nice, especially in urban areas, but you need to make sure you're being very mindful of mulch. You don't want to get too close to that stem. Really good way for me to remember that is donuts are really good, so you have that wide base at the bottom, and volcanoes up against the stem are not good. So just think about that when you're putting mulch out. And then also, as always, it's really important to know before you dig. Before we did this project, we called the power lines and had everything marked, so we knew that we weren't going to hit anything that could potentially be dangerous. For trees and shrubs, again, make sure you know before you dig. And then there's also often ordinances about the height of trees and shrubs, so that's something to definitely check ahead of time, especially along rights-of-way. They usually don't like trees in those areas. Again, incorporating trees and shrubs can be a good benefit to pollinators, aside from just native plugs or native forbs and native wildflowers. Again, you want to make sure you're minimizing weed competition. Again, this is still really good site prep. When you do this, you have to think long term. If you're using chemicals possibly for site prep or to keep weeds from growing up around the base of trees, a lot of people use broadleaf herbicides. Keep in mind that your tree itself is a broadleaf plant, so if you don't apply properly, you could potentially drift it onto your tree, and you don't want that either. When you're planting trees, a good rule of thumb is to make sure you're at least 20 feet away from any structures. But then you can also plant trees maybe 8 to 10 feet on center. Again, you can use the full size height as a factor there. And then shrubs can usually be planted 3 to 6 feet on center, or they can be planted in between trees. These are recommendations for probably more urbanized areas, but just think about that before you start planting. Think about maybe where your roots will be going, that type of thing. Again, trees and shrubs can be planted almost any time of year. But again, you want to avoid those really, really hot sunny days. And it's just really important that you give any plant that you plant enough time for it to establish before winter hits. Proper planting, again, is important. Again, site prep is really important. And you want to make sure you're digging your hole about 1 to 1.5 times the width of the root system that you have if you get a container grown tree or one of those trees in burlap. The hole should not be deeper than the depth of the main root system, because you could plant too deeply and cause a problem. Once you plant them, you need to make sure beforehand you're moving all the wire, containers, those types of things. And usually they have you cut off any problematic roots that may be growing maybe in a circle from where it's been potted. Those are the things to catch early on so that you can have the best tree growth. When you first plant a tree, watering trees is a little more tricky than watering plugs. The rule of thumb is to slowly add 5 gallons of water around the base of each tree, and then you want to add an additional gallon per inch of your trunk diameter. So that can be a really big time and effort constraint. However, if you take the time to do that, it can really enhance your planting and really have good long-term success. And then again, when you're thinking about trees, it's kind of like with the planting, the first year or two, it's really going to be your most effort. So you have to think about, if you're mulching, again, making sure you're not too close to there, watching your mowers and weed eaters. If you're going to, tying things around your trees can potentially girdle them. So you have to think about that as well. And then we do have wildlife that does like to browse on trees. So you might want to consider those little things at the bottom that plastic can expand as the tree grows to help prevent wildlife damage, depending on what your goals are. So once you've installed it, the first 3 years is going to be the most time-consuming part of your habitat. The most important thing to remember is patience. A lot of people will call in a panic after the first year of planting, and realistically, they just need to wait it out and keep going with the plan and stick to it. Native seeds, because of those deep root systems, spend the first 2 years putting down those roots. And again, it's an early, I guess I didn't really talk about that before. So it's an early successional habitat. So if you think about a vacant lot that nothing is done to it and how it eventually gets invaded by woody growth, weeds, and those types of things. An early successional habitat, which is what most of our prairie plantings, grassland plantings, and wildflower plots are, they're early successional habitats. So you can't just plant them and walk away and expect it to work. They need monitoring. You need to keep watching for invasive species or aggressive species. And when you're doing this, when you're controlling weeds in the first 3 years, you're controlling weed density, not eliminating them. There's a lot of weeds like mare's tail, I guess horsetail, whichever, there's a lot of different names for it, ragweed, those things that actually are beneficial and native to wildlife. So you just want to reduce them, not completely eliminate them. What you really should be concerned about is if you see large growths of one plant that may be invasive or may not be what you wanted. Those are the ones that you really have to watch. And then when you're removing anything that you may not want there, you have to use your best judgment for weed control methods. You could potentially spray them, but that may affect other plants that you don't want to target. You could hand pull weeds, but that may spread seed and may be labor intensive. So those are all things that you have to consider. So this is a planting that is in the first year. And what you can see here is you see black-eyed Susan. There's other plants in there that you can't really see from a distance. There's some mare's tail in there, and the rye, of course. But you're seeing that there is some stands here and there of mare's tail, but it's not horrible, and it will eventually go away. So usually when I give a plan, I usually incorporate a calendar like this. That may not be the case for all biologists, but that's what I like to do. Again, it's an early successional habitat, so you have to think of a way to maintain them in the first 3 years. In urban areas, that is most commonly mowing, but you can also do things like disking, herbicide application, and prescribed fire. But essentially what you're doing in those first 3 years is it's thinning those grasses that are important for stand improvement, which allows sunlight to hit the other seeds that may not grow right away, and it also helps to reduce that woody encroachment. So usually what I recommend is that you want to do 2 mows in the first 2 years. You're going to do one around the 4th of July and one around Labor Day. That's usually what I recommend. You can potentially mow more often, because more mowing can actually help wildflowers specifically establish, because it allows that sunlight to get down there. But the kicker for doing that is that you're only mowing when it gets up to 18 inches, and you're only mowing it down to 8 inches. That's because you don't want that thatch to start piling up, because that thatch then can start compounding on your seeds, and then that can also block the sun. So if you're looking for reference, and you obviously don't want to go out and try and measure with a ruler 18 inches, but think about going from thigh high down to calf high. If you don't have the equipment, that can be a little more challenging, but things like weed whackers can be used. If you have a really small area, like in front of a building, you can even use hand clippers. Those are things that you can do. In urban areas, especially, if thatch gets way too thick, you can remove it. And generally, in the first 3 years during establishment or after establishment, you don't want to do habitat work from April 1st to August 1st, because that's primary nesting seasons for a lot of wildlife. But keep in mind, in the first 3 years, you're trying to establish long-term habitat, so it is okay if you do a little bit around the 4th of July and Labor Day, and maybe more often mows. It'll change once it's established. So a good example of this is these are 2 sites. They are prepped by the same person, very similar seed mixes, similar site conditions. But what you can see here is that picture that I showed you earlier. Essentially, you get what effort you put into it, and it doesn't always necessarily have to be monetary. This costs essentially the same. The person on the left just put in a little more effort. And again, you can see the things that you'd want to see. Some mare's tail, some you can see your black-eyed Susan coming in, that rye, all looks good. This person didn't mow anything at all the first year, actually year and a half actually. And this is essentially all just ragweed that is my height. So I'm 5'8" for reference. So it's pretty tall. And that's what we don't want, because that tall, thick vegetation can shade out what you're growing. So that's the kind of thing that you want to think for large patches of something. Things here and there are okay. Large swaths are probably more concerning. So in the first year, so there's a lot of things that you can do to indicate that your habitat's doing well. It can be very difficult, especially for people like me that are not great plant identifiers, especially if stuff doesn't bloom right away or it's really young and you can't tell. But kickers, really be patient. It takes 2 to 3 years for your planting to establish. I think, unfortunately, a lot of times people are not told how long it take to establish a native planting, but we need to be realistic in the amount of time it may take. Again, there will always be weeds, and just keep in mind herbicides can damage what you planted, so you might have to hand pull, but hand pull, you may scatter seeds, so you have to think about those types of things. Essentially, a weed is just a plant growing where it's not wanted. So beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Some people have weeds. Some people consider weeds are not weeds, and vice versa. So things like foxtail, ragweed, mare's tail, those are all native plants that are just weedy. Most will go away, and they still are good habitat. And if you completely eliminate them, that might actually be damaging your habitat. Um, you also, if you drill your plants, that's something that's a benefit. You can look for plants growing in rows. You can look for native plants that grow quickly. Your partridge pea and black-eyed Susan are two things that grow pretty quickly and are really easy to spot. And then you just need to make sure that you're watching for invasive species, things like Canada thistle, Johnson grass, Chinese bush clover. Those are all things that can invade. But to point out how tricky it can be, this is actually a picture of a native pasture thistle, and this is actually a good pollinator plant. You can see all the pollinators on it, and you can't see in this picture, but you can see little hairs on the stem. Most people might have actually thought that was a Canada thistle, which we don't want, but that's where it can get a little bit tricky. So taking time to practice identification and looking at those things are really helpful. And the good thing is you have a while to establish, so you have time to practice. After the first 2 years, you're going to still have to disturb by mowing, disking, spraying, prescribed fire. Again, they're early successional habitats. If they're left undisturbed, they will go back to woody vegetation. You're always going to want to monitor for noxious weeds. Once it's established, you're going to want to avoid April 1st through August 1st. That's when most of those animals are rearing young, building nests, those types of things. You can also get a little creative. Different species have slightly different nesting times, so you can learn what you want to manage for and try to avoid those times that those animals might be reproducing. Once you're maintaining, you don't want to you don't want to disturb whole areas at a time. You're usually only going to disturb 30 to 60% of an area at one time, and you're going to rotate portions each time you disturb it. It could be that you're doing it every 3 to 5 years. Some people do it every 2 years, every 7 years. Ideally, the reason that you're rotating these portions is that when you start mowing, burning, etc., you're taking away the habitat briefly for it to come back. So you want adjacent habitat to be there for a refuge, essentially. This is probably not as necessary in maybe smaller urban plantings, but it is really important for larger plantings. And it's really important, again, to be flexible. You just have to really assess your site every year and see what is needed. There's benefits to the time of year that you do them. I mentioned the July and August mow in the first 2 years. In year 3, you're really only going to pick one time. You can either do it in the early July or you can do the August mow. They each have their own benefits and drawbacks. For example, if you mow in July, then you'll have more standing vegetation for winter habitat. But if you mow in the fall, that might be better for your forbs that you want to grow. So keep that in mind. You can adjust for the species that you're looking to manage for. If you're mowing or if you're using prescribed fire and maybe have a patch that didn't burn or didn't get mowed all the way down, that's okay. That's a mosaic effect, and you can see little pockets of refuge in the area that you're planting. You don't have to scorch the earth if you burn. So those are things to think about. We do provide technical assistance at the Division of Fish and Wildlife. If we can't help you, we can usually refer you to someone who can. As technical assistance, we can also do burn plans for you, so that's something to think about. So if you're going to look to enhance your habitat, there's a couple different things you can do. You can create things like water access with a well-managed pond or wetland. Wildlife boxes are a really good thing that you can do. You can make them for different bird species, bats. There's even bee and pollinator boxes now that are pretty interesting. The best thing for these is that you still want to make sure they're properly maintained and cleaned when in between residents. There's a lot of really great resources for these. There's a lot of right ways to do them, but there's also some wrong ways to do them. So those are the biggest things to keep in mind. You can also get creative with wildlife boxes because even like a wood duck, there's really specific parameters for building your box. So it can be really cool to get creative and see what works for which types of species. Snags, which are essentially just dead standing trees, where they're safe, they can be left into a habitat. They're really good habitat for things like woodpeckers, and then once the woodpeckers are finished, it can create dens for other wildlife. Brush piles, which may not be as acceptable in urban areas, they can be really good for things like small mammals, for herps like salamanders, snakes, turtles, those types of things. And putting trails in there that keep, oh, sorry guys, putting trails in there where people can enjoy them without trampling an area, that's a really good thing to do. And again, it's important to have fun, to learn and grow. Everything will change and it's going to take time to learn. Most biologists are still learning, so that's where the fun can be. Other considerations to enhance your habitat, it can be really hard to convince people that habitat is good. So it might be beneficial to you to indicate that your habitat is being maintained. Things like educational signage, incorporating paths and walkways, and then reaching out and educating others. This is a sign that the urban program gives out for their program when they do habitat work, but there's other things like the Monarch Way Station, Indiana Wildlife, or the Certified Backyard Habitat Program. Those are all things that you can do. We talked about there's some aggressive species, so milkweed is a good native, but it can be aggressive in some areas. So maybe think about not planting aggressive species in areas where people may get more easily upset. Things like goldenrods, cut plants, and some milkweeds can really spread. Make sure you supervise your pets at all times. All pets, cats, dogs, birds, if you take your fish out and walk, they should all be supervised. It keeps your pet safe and it keeps wildlife safe. It keeps wildlife safe as well. We'd encourage you to keep wildlife wild, not handling, enjoying from a distance, and only intervening if absolutely necessary. And there's a lot of rules and regulations on those, so I would encourage you to reach out to a professional ahead of time before intervening. And then also tolerating messiness. A natural decomposition provides good nutrients back into the soil. Leaves in the winter can be a good place for pollinators to hide. If you delay your mowing, it can actually create winter habitat for wildlife and other species. And then other litter can also enhance your habitat, or what is traditionally considered litter. These are the same resources as last time. Our website has seed suppliers, habitat fact sheets, and biologists that you can contact. The USDA NRCS website has seeding calculators, web soil surveys, in your local soil and water conservation districts. They also have things like different habitat programs that may be helpful to you. And then the Purdue Extension Store has things like fact sheets, workshops, and videos for things like calibrating drills and those things of that nature. There's a lot of other resources as well, and I believe Morgan will be sending this information out to you at some point. So with that, thank you very much for listening. Hopefully you got a lot out of it, and then I think right now we'll take time for questions.
All right, thank you, Jessica. We've got, let me make sure I didn't miss any here. Okay, so we've got one question from Peg. She asked, what would you be spraying? It was on a little bit of an earlier slide, but Peg, could you clarify what portion you were referring to with that?
I was talking about in the third year where you mentioned burning, mowing, or spraying, and I'm wondering what you would be spraying without killing the plants. It said burning, mowing, disking, or spraying that third year.
Sometimes strip spraying is incorporated to help reduce that competition, and it may actually end up being killing some of the stuff you want, but it helps benefit to help with new growth. So it may help knock back some of the stuff that's already grown so that the other seeds have time to establish as well.
Thank you.
If you guys have any questions, you're welcome to drop them in the chat box or hop on verbally. Either one works.
Hi there. Are you there? Yeah. I was just curious. I've had my pond, the silt taken out of it, so it was a little deeper and a little more habitat. And I've got all this open area around it. And I wondered, is there something in particular that I could, broadcast out there to take root? And it's right now, it's just, of course, mud.
Muck or muddy sites can be really tricky, but you can create a specific seed mixer there. It's kind of hard just to tell off the top of my head because I don't know where you are physically, but if you wanted to reach out to me or one of the other district biologists, we could probably point you in the right direction of some options.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
I'll drop that link in the chat box here in a second, but I'm also going to send out a list of like helpful resources to you guys after this, along with a link to a survey.
Okay.
There's also, if you have a pond, there is some good pond management information that's on our website as well.
There's the link for our district wildlife biologist in the chat box. Here's a link to our pond or lake management website. I'm also going to post that in the chat box as well.
So you're muted.
Any other questions? Sorry. Okay.
I do have a quick question.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Is there anybody that could actually come out to a property and make recommendations for habitat and wildlife? I mean, not the wildlife, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, so actually that is a service that our district biologists can provide, depending on where they are. They do have technically priority areas as well. So you should really just reach out to your district biologist, depending on where you're located.
I'm in Anderson.
So is that Marion County?
No, Madison County.
So a lot of that would actually be our other urban biologists down south, but there's also other parts that would be the district area as well. But that should probably be all under the urban, and depending on the project and that type of thing, she might be able to come out and do a site assessment for you.
Okay, that's the kind of thing I was looking for, to see if that's possible even.
Yep, it just kind of depends. All the district biologists, like I said, have priority areas, and, as well as the urban biologists. So just feel free to reach out, and even if they cannot do it, sometimes they can point you in the right direction of someone else that may be able to come do a site visit, or they can, if you give them a map of where they are, they can also give you other recommendations that way.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Jessica, correct me if I'm wrong, but those district wildlife biologists can also let you know if you qualify for any habitat assistance programs, right?
Right, I should have mentioned that as well. The district biologists and the urban biologists do have cost share funding available for qualifying projects every year. So that may be a question as well. And then we have Farm Bill biologists that can help with some of those NRCS programs that I mentioned that are on their website as well. That's something depending on your acreage and that type of thing that is available.
Last call for questions.
And if at any point you guys want to shoot an email, that's okay too. So.
Thank you very much.
I think that might have been all we had. So I'm going to go ahead and post a link here in the chat box to a survey. And in that survey, you guys can tell us how we did, if there's anything we can improve upon with this presentation, and also if there's any other topics that you're interested in having us cover. We have a wide array of content experts in this department, and we're happy to help assist you and provide future webinars on these educational topics. So I'll drop that here, and I'll also send out an email to y'all afterwards with some helpful resources and links for building backyard habitat, and then another link to this survey. Any future webinars that we're going to have are going to be posted on the DNR calendar, and then we'll also advertise them via our social media channels. But anyway, thank you so much, Jessica, for presenting. You did such a great job.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Morgan, for facilitating. I appreciate it.
And thank you guys all for coming. We hope you learned something new.